Hi. My question is kind of specific. I was in a recent conversation with a Jehovah's Witness, and he surprised me with a bit of doctrine that I didn't know they believed. He told me that they didn't believe that Jesus was actually raised bodily, but just in spirit. So then I pointed him to the end of Luke, where he came and ate with his disciples, and they touched his hands. And he, at that point, said, well, Jesus didn't raise bodily, he just rematerialized as a spirit, and he put on a body at that point. And then he pointed me to Genesis 18, where Abraham sat with 3 angels, and they ate with him. And I was wondering how you might answer that, any of you.
The official teaching on Jesus by the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society is correct in the sense that Jesus rose invisibly as a spirit. They believe that he returned to Brooklyn, New York in 1914 invisibly to head up the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, which the Jehovah's Witnesses consider the theocratic kingdom of God on earth, which is why they will not pledge their allegiance to a particular country or nationality, because they believe they are living under God's theocratic kingdom, and that Jesus literally runs the Watchtower organization as an invisible spirit from Brooklyn, New York today. Obviously, as Christians who believe in a bodily resurrection, we would have a number of disagreements with that teaching, and I think one of the ways that we can talk to Jehovah's Witnesses is to talk about some of the historical arguments that we have to believe in a physical, material resurrection of Christ, a physical bodily ascension into heaven. That's the testimony of the early church and the overwhelmingly compelling evidence in regards to that. So I don't know if anybody has anything to add on that point. My game plan was to come up here and basically defer to Dr. Craig on everything. So if this is how this is going to be, we're in trouble here, guys. All right?
Hi, my name is Josiah Dalkey, and I have a question about moral relativism. So I have a couple of friends that have an understanding that there is such a thing as objective truth, but because we don't actually know what that objective truth is, then therefore we can't force our opinions upon other people. I was just wondering if you had any comments on that.
Can you restate exactly the last part again for me? You said you have somebody who says there's no such thing as moral truth, but has a problem with forcing the moral truths on people?
Yeah, so there is such a thing as objective truth, they claim, but because we as finite beings do not because we as finite beings don't actually know what that objective truth is, then therefore we can't actually decide.
I guess I would have a couple questions. I'd say there's a difference between the truth you want to make and how you want to interact with somebody. Those are not always the same thing. So if somebody says there's an objective moral truth, but we can't know it, I simply want to know how that person knows that. And I don't mean that in a trite way. I'd simply say, how do you know that there's an objective moral standard that's out there and that we as human beings are incapable of knowing it? I would simply want to know. And then I would point out examples. I would say, I think there are certain moral things that we simply know, and we know that we know them. And you got to kind of take the most extreme example that the person is going to agree with and say, so let me ask you a question. Is it wrong to torture an innocent child for fun? And you have to add the fun, because someone's going to say, well, if there's a nuclear bomb, okay, fine. Is it wrong to torture an innocent child for fun? And most people are going to say yes. And I think Dr. Craig is right. If somebody says, I'm not sure about that, that person doesn't need an argument. That person needs a therapist. So one way is to take what's called the particularist position, just say, you know what, there is right and wrong, and you know there's right and wrong. And by the way, if somebody says you shouldn't force your morals upon somebody else, something Greg Kokel has taught me, he'll ask the question back, is that your morality? And the person has to say yes. So if it's your morality that we shouldn't force our morals upon somebody else, why are you trying to force that moral principle upon me? it simply self-destructs when you ask a few questions and probe further.
Okay, so I had a question about the Kalam cosmological argument. I want to get a better idea of what you mean by a beginning, because normally when I think of a beginning, I think of an entity which at some point in time didn't exist, and then at some point it comes into existence, and that's its beginning. But I'm not sure if that's the sense in which the universe could have a beginning, because there can't be a time in which the universe didn't exist, because time is part of the universe. So I was hoping to get clarification on that.
Very good. This is one of the tools of philosophy, conceptual analysis, to analyze what it means to begin to exist, for example. And intuitively, a common sense view would be, well, X begins to exist if it exists at a time t, and there was a time t prime earlier than that at which it did not exist. And that would seem to be a common sense notion of begins to exist, except when you apply it to time itself. It would make it impossible for time to begin to exist, wouldn't it? Because if time began to exist, there would have to be a time before which time began to exist, which is contradictory. And yet cosmologists do think that time began to exist, and they're not uttering an incoherence. So we need a more nuanced definition of what it is to begin to exist. And here's one that I would suggest, is X begins to exist at t if X exists at t and there is no time t prime earlier than t at which X exists. X exists at t, and there is no time earlier than t at which X exists. And that would allow time in the universe to have a beginning, because there is no time earlier than that time at which the universe existed. So where you put the negation in the sentence is critical in terms of having a coherent definition of begins to exist.
My question is for Dr. Craig as well. Having to do with the cosmological argument for God's existence, I've heard a response to that online basically being that is basically our philosophical concept of time, that we have a linear timeline on how we see things. But what about, how would you respond to somebody that might bring up the B theory of time, where time is more of just an illusion and it's just like more of a state of flux in the universe rather than an actual linear progression of events? How would that fit the argument? How would you respond to that, please?
Anybody who has to dismiss fundamental elements of our experience as illusions needs to have a very powerful argument in order to defeat what we sense and experience. Cosmology is based upon the assumption that the universe has a history, that it has evolved over time, and that if you trace the expansion of the universe back in time far enough, you come to a beginning. And it would require a very powerful argument to say that time is an illusion. That would be rather like saying that my sensory experience of the external world is all an illusion, that maybe I'm just a brain in a vat and there is no external world, and everything I think is just an illusion of my consciousness. That would require an extremely powerful argument in order to defeat my sensory experience of the external world. And the evidence or the experience of the reality of time, I think, is even stronger than my experience of the external world. Because not only do I have an experience of temporal passage in the external world, but there is also temporal passage in the inner world of the mind, as I experience a succession of contents of consciousness, one thought after another. So the person who says that temporal passage is illusory is having to defeat not only my apprehension of the external world, but even my apprehension of the contents of consciousness in the inner world of the mind. And there is no such defeater. There is no argument that could be offered to show that these are all illusory, and therefore you're perfectly justified with going what your senses and science tell you, that there is an objective, linear, temporal process going on both in the world around you as well as in your thought life.
Hello. My question is regarding the LGBT movement that is spreading across. And as you know, we have that florist here locally who was sued for not agreeing to arrange flowers for a gay wedding. I guess my question is that as Christians, we approach the issue in a Christian worldview. As for the non-Christian worldview, they approach it in a secular worldview. So I guess my question is, how do you bridge the gap in which, when you're discussing issues in these matters, that they realize that you are looking at it in a Christian kind of perspective, and they want that separation of kind of church and state kind of issue that plays into it, where we can't legislate laws that are, religiously kind of loaded, I guess, in that sense. So how as Christians do we navigate that in terms of, representatives and laws that are being passed? Because it seems like we're kind of losing the culture war in that sense, because since they find out that you're a Christian, then you're automatically bigoted or prejudiced, and the conversation seems to just stop right there when it can't seem to continue once they already slap that label on you.
I'll assume, since I did a session on same-sex marriage, that question was for me. I think there was two kind of questions at play here. One is, how personally do we do this? And second, how do we pass laws, and how far should we take legislation? Those are distinct questions. And I would say this: even if I were not a Christian, I would still be a supporter of natural marriage. I would be. Because the nature of what marriage is, by looking at objective reality, by kids needing a mom and a dad, looking at the function in society in which marriage has played and should play for the better part of society, I actually would be in favor of natural marriage, even if I were not a Christian. Now, with that said, when it comes to laws, every single law legislates some morality. Every law does. So sometimes they'll point at Christians and say we shouldn't legislate morality. Every single law legislates some morality. The question is, what law is going to be legislated and why? So when it comes to things like same-sex marriage, we have to make our case without appealing to the Scriptures. I think people have done that, and if we lose the laws, we lose the laws. We have to do our best, but it doesn't mean we stop trying or we just point to the Scriptures in defense of those. I think the larger culture, though, hasn't been lost because of people made better apologetic arguments on the other side. I think they told better stories. I think Joe Biden was right, and you're not going to hear me quote Joe Biden a lot, to be honest, but he was right. He said, he referred to Will and Grace as having more influence on the same-sex marriage debate than anything else. So one thing we need to do as Christians, we absolutely have to keep doing apologetics, but we have to tell better stories about marriage. We have to tell better stories about parenting. We have to be able to capture the imagination so people are open to the mind. So when it comes to relationships, this is why I think relationships are so important. You said the view of Christians is that we're bigoted, hateful, and homophobic. People see that in the media all the time. But I think one way we can turn that so people are open to the gospel is when people hear that and they have a relationship with someone like each one of us here, and they hear Christians are hateful, and their first thought is, gosh, man, my neighbor Larry's not. He's gracious. He's kind. He sees the world differently, but he loves me. That's when I think we win a hearing back. So relationships have always been important, but now the time it's more important than ever, Now, with that said, last thing is one of the strategies of the revisionist side is to build relationships with people so they see that gays are just normal people, they're not ruining the country, and it'll change their theology. So what we need to do is absolutely have relationships with people, not just to convert them, but to love them as human beings. But we better know our theology well. We better know how to think about marriage and not just point to Genesis 1, as important as that is, but be able to make a case for natural marriage. And in my experience, very few people today even know why marriage matters for society. Well, no wonder Christians don't stand up and speak boldly about it. We haven't thought deeply enough about it. So keep speaking truth, tell better stories, and build relationships with people is, I think, some of the most important things we need to do moving forward.
I have a question.
One person, thank you.
My question is about free will and predeterminism, specifically as it talks about Judas. Did he have the choice to not betray Jesus, or was his life predetermined? And I say that because Jesus said it would have been better for him to not have been born.
Judas, right? Not Jesus. Judas.
Is the question, because Jesus predicted the betrayal of Judas, that therefore Judas was fated to betray him and had no free will? Yes. Okay, I can speak to that. I did some work on divine foreknowledge and human freedom, and it seems to me that divine foreknowledge is entirely compatible with freedom of the will. It's logically fallacious to say, necessarily, if God foreknows X, then X will happen. God foreknows X, therefore necessarily X will happen. That commits a logical fallacy in modal logic. From the two premises, necessarily if God foreknows X, X will happen, and God foreknows X, what follows is merely that X will happen, but not that X will happen necessarily. X could fail to happen, but if it were to fail to happen, then God would have foreknown something else instead. So the fact that God foreknows, or Jesus predicted, Judas's betrayal in no way robs Judas of his free will. Judas could have done otherwise, but if he were to do otherwise, Jesus would have predicted something else instead.
All right.
Next.
Okay, that's me then. I just have 87 questions, so no. I just wanted to ask two questions, but I wanted to make a quick observation of the scripture that since it was a little silent on one of the questions in regards to the Jehovah's Witness. If you go to Luke 24th chapter and verse 36, it says, this is where Jesus appears to the disciples. As they were talking about these things, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace to you." But they were startled and frightened and thought they saw a spirit. That's exactly what the Jehovah's Witnesses are saying. Oh, no, they only saw a spirit. He's a spirit creature. He's not in bodily form and stuff. But if you go on and read just another couple verses or the whole paragraph, Jesus said, "Why are you troubled, and why do doubts arise in your hearts? See my hands and my feet, that it is myself. Touch me and see, for a spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have." And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. And while they were disbelieving for joy and were marveling, he said to them, "Have you anything here to eat?" So I think that kind of answers that question a little bit. And I have one question each for the Craigs. One is, what is the necessity for you to believe in old earth? What is the necessity for you to believe that there's old earth rather than young earth? And that's to you?
What is the necessity?
Yeah.
Well, I would just say that the scientific evidence overwhelmingly supports the idea that the earth is very ancient and that there's nothing in the Bible that requires you to believe otherwise. I think that when you read the Genesis narrative from the standpoint of an ancient Hebrew author, there are actually indications in the text itself that it doesn't think that this is a literal week of consecutive 24-hour days. And so I think the Bible gives you the freedom to follow the scientific evidence where it leads, which is that the world is indeed very ancient. When you think that we can see the stars, that very simple fact that you can see these stars billions of light years away shows how ancient the universe is. The person who thinks the world was created a few thousand years ago would have to say God not only created the stars and the earth, but he created the starlight, the star beam in between the star and the earth so that it would hit our retinas and we would have the illusion of seeing these distant objects. And that is so ad hoc and artificial, it strikes me as far more plausible to think that these distant objects have emitted this light, it's come to us, and now we see them, and that therefore the universe is very ancient.
I would love to argue, but for the other Craig, I've noticed that you had mentioned something about that a good Jew that would not go to a cemetery and be there at night and stuff. So I was wondering what you had to say in regards to at the tomb, there were the guards that were guarding the tomb, and of course they were Roman, but weren't there also temple guards, or just the seal over that, or what?
There's no indication that they were temple guards. My point is that the presentation in the Gospel of Peter, which I think is an exaggerated fictional account, very overt apologetic efforts, composed in the middle, at the earliest, the middle of the 2nd century, was just to increase the male witnesses and hostile witnesses for apologetic purposes, because that is precisely what Celsus complains about at the end of the 2nd century, is that the witnesses of the resurrection are hysterical women. And that a more convincing story would have the resurrected Jesus appearing to his enemies and to men. Well, the Gospel of Peter is answering that very objection. And so, but it does so clumsily, doesn't really know who is in command of Judea and Jerusalem, isn't aware that to say that Jewish elders would spend the night in a cemetery, is not aware of the fear of ghosts and uncleanness and how that would be most unlikely. Now, trained soldiers under command, that's another matter. Even if they happen to be Jewish, not necessarily Roman, that's another matter. It's like police officers, they face danger. But no Jewish scribe, no Jewish elder is going to spend the night. The author of the Gospel of Peter isn't even clear on the chronology. Which night are we talking about? Friday night? Saturday night? He's not clear. I don't know if he even knows there's more than one night. So that's my whole point. The author of the Gospel of Peter, the way he tells the story, doesn't know Jewish tradition, customs, sensitivities, doesn't really know the Jewish realities of burial tradition and so forth, and is driven entirely by a mid-2nd century apologetic to gussy up the story a little bit and make it more convincing as he thinks it needs to be made.
Okay, thank you.
My question is primarily for Dr. Sean McDowell. I have known a handful of homosexuals, primarily lesbians, and I've been good friends with several of them. And one of them is an active Christian. She's actively pursuing God, and she's fighting these feelings that she has. And she described to me once that she feels it is something that she had no choice over, that it wasn't something she chose or that spontaneously arose. It was just a part of her. And so I'm curious what encouragement you give for other people struggling with that same feeling as Christians, and what you would recommend how to approach that from non-Christians when they present the same viewpoint of themselves.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. I would say that I really don't believe people simply choose to have same-sex attraction. I believe many of my gay friends, Christian or non-Christian, who will say, I didn't ask for this. In fact, I would have it taken away in a heartbeat if I could. I find no reason to question that. I think that's very sincere. On the flip side, even the APA would say we don't know what causes same-sex attraction. We don't know. It's probably some combination of nature and nurture. And there's probably very different kinds of things that can cause it to be in somebody in different ways than it is from somebody else. Now, as Christians, we kind of have a cause. It's called original sin. That all of us are born with different desires and attractions that we didn't ask for and we don't want. And the question is, what are we going to do with them? So I found in many conversations, I'll say, look, I believe you that you didn't ask for this. And the question is, what are we going to do with this? So I found a lot of times, especially on this issue, I'll spend more time listening than I do talking. I'll just say, tell me your story. When did you first come to grips with same-sex attraction? How did people treat you when you came across same-sex attraction? What are some helpful things people did? What are some unhelpful things that people have done? Because I think studies showing there's just a lot of hurt that's involved around this question personally and corporately, that carving some of that away just to have space to talk and be real is helpful with people. Now, what I would do is, because I don't have same-sex attraction, I'm not going to pretend I've heard people say, oh man, I've been attracted to this, I totally know what you mean. Well, I don't think you do. I've had some of my gay friends say to me, you cannot understand what it's like to have same-sex attraction because of the nature of this if you don't have it. And I'll say, fine, I concede that. But I know some Christians who are faithful and who are single amidst this. And I want to introduce you to them if you're open to them. People like Christopher Yuan from Moody Bible College. And he's writing a book on singleness and being a Christian. People like Ed Shaw, who's written a book called Same-Sex Attraction in the Church. Because a lot of same-sex desires are rooted in deep, important human needs that we have. For affection, to be cared for love. These are good, natural desires in a sense that all of us have. The question is, how can this person begin to have those deeper relational needs met in a healthy way that's honoring with what the Scripture teaches? So people like the book by Ed Shaw, Same-Sex Attraction in the Church, and Christopher Yuan can be a model for many of these people struggling with this, who want to live out their faith faithfully in terms of what Jesus taught, and finding help from other Christians. And I'd also encourage that person, I'd say, let me find some other Christians around here that struggle with same-sex attraction. You can identify them, you will understand them, and find kind of a solidarity that'll help those people through the difficult questions that you're asking.
Hello, this question is for William Lane Craig. So when you're talking about the problem of evil and suffering, if you make the assumption that free will does not exist, how would you go about approaching that problem?
Okay, if we make what assumption?
That free will does not exist.
Oh. I'll leave that up to the Calvinists. That's a huge problem. It seems to me that in the absence of free will, it's almost inevitable that you make God the author of sin and the author of evil, which I regard as unconscionable and unacceptable. So for me, free will is a non-negotiable. And I think that Reformed thinkers are going to be very, very hard-pressed to have any kind of acceptable solution to the problem of evil that will not make God the author of evil and sin.
Yes, Dr. Craig, last night you opened up that can of worms about the billions versus millions of years. And since this is an apologetics conference, I wanted to give you an opportunity to make a defense. In light of Scripture, and I appreciate the fact that Christian brethren can have disagreements on this issue, and it's certainly not a salvation issue, so I want to make that clear. But I do think it has some real importance, and I would go to Mark chapter 10, where Jesus is making a case against divorce. And in doing so, he makes the statement that, have you not read that God made Adam and Eve and marriage at the beginning of the creation? His point being that because it was foundational to everything God was about, that's why you shouldn't get divorced. Nevertheless, he makes this point about creation, that he made Adam and Eve in marriage at the beginning of the creation. So given that statement by Jesus, did God create Adam and Eve in marriage 14 billion years after the beginning of the creation? Or did he create Adam and Eve in marriage within 6 days of the beginning of the creation? And that's really for all of you, not just Dr. Craig.
I don't think Jesus does say at the beginning of creation in that passage. He says that from the beginning it has not always been so. God made them male and female, etc. And he could be talking about the beginning of the book of Genesis or the beginning of the human race. I think you're trying to freight this single verse with an enormous amount of theological weight that it simply doesn't bear.
Let me give a plug for something. Some of you I know are very interested because you've asked me outside of this on the age of the earth, in a particular Dr. Craig's view of creation. He has 2 weekly podcasts. If you don't listen to him, you need to listen to him. One is Reasonable Faith, where he answers questions like this live. The second one is the Defender's Sunday school class that he teaches. And he spent, I don't know how many weeks, 20-some weeks on creation, going step by step through the different views. I've listened to it twice. Super helpful. You might disagree with him when it's all said and done, but he lays out carefully all the different views, critiques them, and really fair. If this is a question, I'd go back to the Defender's class, look at a series on creation. I'm sure it's in the feed or on his website. Well worth the time to go back and wrestle through that. Defender's class, and then the other one is just Reasonable Faith, right? I'm giving you a serious plug here, Dr. Craig.
You really are, Sean,
it's helpful,
and that's very
though.
kind, right? The Defenders is my weekly Sunday school class in Christian doctrine and apologetics. And there is a section called Doctrine of Creation. And there's an excursus on creation evolution where we look at the opening chapter of Genesis and discuss about 9 different interpretations of this and assess their strengths and weaknesses, including the literal interpretation and others. And so this is an open question, I think, among Christians, and not one, frankly, that ought to occupy our time here at a conference like this, which should, I think, be occupied more in commending our faith in a secular culture than arguing amongst ourselves.
Hello, gentlemen. Over here. As kind of a newer Christian, I kind of lean towards just my personal personality. I lean towards humanism, want to be more right and prove the argument, and less so much about carrying the person. And it's been a struggle as me trying to mature as a Christian and trying to love the person on the other side, and then also kind of gaining reasons for my faith and trying to love them and also serve them at the same time, and also try to explain what I believe in. How do you kind of temper your definite passion towards, like, I know I'm in the right, but more so still want to take care of the person and try to balance that out? Hopefully that made sense.
Well, you know, in the last session I just taught, I really stressed to the group that was there, 1 Peter 3:15. Peter's admonition is, he calls us to be ready always to give an answer to anyone who asks us for the reason for the hope that we have. All right, that first assumes that they're recognizing a difference about our lives, that there is some hope within us that they're asking us about. But then when they ask us about our hope, we're to be ready and equipped to give them a reasonable answer for why we believe what we believe as Christians. But the second half of that verse is as important as the first half. Peter goes on and he says, and do this with gentleness and respect. And especially in our post-Christian culture today, that piece is so important in our apologetic, evangelistic efforts as Christians. It's one thing, my dad used to always tell me, it's one thing to win the intellectual battle, it's another thing to potentially lose the war for a person's heart. And you can equip yourself with the best apologetic arguments. Here's the thing, we can win the debate, friends. The truth is on our side. So if you study enough and you educate yourself enough, you can become the greatest debater and win every argument out there. But if you walk away from that encounter and the person thinks, man, what a jerk that guy was, right? They're not going to care how smart you were or how many answers you have. And so as Christians, I think that's really a paramount importance for us to balance our truth with our grace and our love. I think Sean's answer earlier, demonstrating that you care enough to hear about their concerns as a person, to hear, what's your background, where are some of their concerns and questions coming from, and then to respond, again, with reasonable answers in a very gracious and compassionate way. That's a powerful apologetic approach.
A question based on your, Dr. Craig, your lecture this morning on good and evil, and suffering. Sorry, it was on suffering and evil. And you kind of cited that butterfly effect, right, which was that the vast complexity of events, it's hard from our limited perspective to see what a situation causes, or what situations, right, are suffering, and what that causes, and kind of that vast complexity of God's kind of intelligence with design. And I wanted to know how you would relate that to the concept of dualism.
To the concept of dualism?
Of dualism. So there's an idea that the creation of that concept, the creation of the separation between good and evil, is what caused that, or the concept of it is what causes the rift, is what causes sin. So I'm kind of wondering if you, or what I've heard, is that, do you believe that perfection of the kingdom of God is an understanding of the worldview without dualism, with a trust in God's grand design, or do you believe that basically that you have to make absent what is evil, like you have to have that separation between God and evil?
Okay, I think you're reading things into what I said that aren't there, if I understand your question. My only point was that when people say that because this evil has entered my life and I don't see any point in it, that therefore probably God doesn't have a morally sufficient reason for allowing that. And my point was that we're simply not in a position to make those kind of probability judgments with any sort of confidence, because God is providentially ordering history so that his ultimate ends are achieved through human free decisions. And he might allow an incident of suffering into my life because 300 years from now, a Mexican peasant will come to Christ and find eternal life as a result of the ripple effect this sends through history. This seems to me to be just so obvious that we are not in a position to make these kind of probability judgments with any confidence, and that therefore the atheist is not justified in saying God probably doesn't have morally sufficient reasons for allowing the evil and suffering in the world. And it doesn't have anything to do with dualism. It just has to do with our limited insight and intelligence, our confinement to a brief time of space and history that prevents us from being able to make these kind of probability judgments.
Dr. Craig, you get to be popular today. So I recently used the moral argument in a conversation I had with an old friend of mine. And it seems to me that there are effectively there's an additional part to the argument where, well, let me just get straight to my question. The first premise of the argument is that if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. And I had trouble when he challenged that. What do you mean? How can that be? And I had trouble articulating a response to that. The second one, I'm pretty clear on your advice on how to implement, come up with examples to demonstrate. But the first one, I wondered if you had any suggestions on that. And I remember the first part of what I was going to say was that the first challenge, which you do take care of in your animated short, is that you're not saying atheists are immoral. You're saying they don't have a foundation for morality. So you have to take some time to explain that, and that usually takes a few minutes. But I had a little bit of trouble on defending the first premise.
Right. The question then concerns an argument for God's existence that we haven't presented at this conference, called the moral argument, which basically goes, 1, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. 2, but objective moral values and duties do exist. 3, therefore God exists. And the question is, how do you defend that first premise, that if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist? Well, what's key here is the word objective. Objective is defined as independent of human opinion. And if you don't have God to be the transcendent anchor of good and evil, right and wrong, then it would seem that you are dependent simply upon socio-cultural evolution of values in human societies, and that there is no objectivity to that because there is no transcendent ground. Moral values would just be the biological spin-offs of evolution and the influence of social conditioning. So that, for example, just as self-sacrificial and even altruistic behavior can be observed among social animals like a troop of baboons, so natural selection is programmed into Homo sapiens, a sort of herd morality which functions well in the perpetuation of our species and the struggle for survival. But there's nothing that makes this morality objectively binding and true. If you were to rewind the film of human evolution and shoot it all over again, a very different sort of creature might have evolved with a very different set of moral values. And for me to say, well, our values are the ones that are true and binding and yours are not, would be an example of speciesism, an unjustified bias in favor of your own species. So it's just, in a sense, an invitation to ask your partner in conversation, if you deny that God exists as the transcendent ground for moral values and duties, what do you propose to replace him with? What is the basis then for objective, mind-independent moral values and duties? And I think he'll be very hard-pressed to come up with anything.
Hi, my question is for Doug. I have a question about the great works than this. I believe you said something about great works are not through miracle, which I believe. But what is great works then? Or what do you consider as great work and biblically speaking?
Okay. Is this on? Okay. So I was saying that on one view, the most natural reading of the passage in John 14:12 is that these are miracles, speaking of Jesus' miracles, and it would follow from that then the greater works would be greater miracles. And but that's not a natural reading of greater miracles, because it would be very difficult to outmatch Jesus with regard to the miracles. So now the question then becomes, well, then what are the works? And that's what you're asking, right? What are they? Well, I mentioned a couple of things. One is the work of preaching the word. That when Jesus did the works of the Father that he was commanded to do, it included his proclamation of the kingdom of heaven that had come. And so I put in there the preaching of the word and actually continuing the preaching that Jesus did after he leaves the earth and goes to the Father. He makes direct reference to the Father when he says, because I go to the Father. Jesus has come to the earth by the will of the Father, and he has done the will of the Father in proclaiming the kingdom of heaven. And he says, now I'm leaving. Okay, so now who's going to do this? Well, you are. So that's part of your work, is to carry on the work that I've done. And it doesn't make direct reference to miracles as any kind of necessity. Now, why is it greater? That might be your real question is, so what's greater about what they do? Well, I do think that the spread of the word is much greater. And it's greater through the power of the Holy Spirit, but through an initial nucleus of followers of Jesus Christ. And so there is a greater effect in terms of the numbers who believe, but not in terms of the numbers of miracles or the difference in quality of miracle or type. So I think that's a big part of it, is and illustrated by what happens shortly after Jesus returns bodily from the grave, and before his ascension promises what's going to happen, what they're going to do. And it's this proclamation. They're going to disseminate the truth worldwide. That's a pretty big task. And so that's a great work that they're going to do, and it's inaugurated in actual concrete events at Pentecost when Peter preaches and so many believe. And that brings me then to the second part of what could be included in the scope of a work, is the believing itself as a work. And then I mentioned the idea of Paul's, that there is the obedience of faith. And so exercising faith is itself a work. And so they're evoking that in their preaching, appealing to others to believe as well, and that is an extension of the work of Jesus Christ. So they do the same things, but there's an extension of what he does, and that's the sense in which it's greater. Now, none of this precludes the actual occurrence of miracles or their performance of miracles, of course, because if you look at the book of Acts, you see them doing many of the same things, but you don't see them doing greater works in the miracle sense in the book of Acts. And if you want to know what the greater works are, Acts is the place to turn for the answer to that question, not to something that self-proclaimed apostles and prophets are saying about their own acts 2,000 years later after what they call a hiatus in miraculous events.
Hi, this question is for Dr. Craig. And it has to do with, I'm curious, what impact have you found the ontological argument to have with atheists that you've come in contact with? And the background is, when I've talked to atheists and presented to them the ontological argument as a, what do you think about this? What impact does this have on you? They kind of give me a blank stare as a, well, you're a believer, so that would make sense to you, but that doesn't have any impact on me. And even I was listening last year, I think Alvin Plantinga was interviewed on Justin Brierley's Unbelievable, and Justin Brierley asked him that, what do you think about the ontological argument and as a persuasive method? And he basically swatted it away and said, I don't think you should use that at all. But I hear you talk about it all the time, so I'm curious, what has been your experience with atheists when you present the ontological argument? Does it have an impact on them?
Well, I can't say that I've had any experience with atheists in presenting the ontological argument, but I have been very surprised by the feedback that I get from people about the ontological argument. We produced a little animated video comparable to the ones that I've shown at this conference on the ontological argument. And I thought that it would elicit the sort of reaction that you mentioned, skepticism and irrelevance. But I've been rather pleased and surprised by the number of people who find this to be very powerful. Now, maybe they're already Christians, I don't know. I have no way of knowing from these sort of Facebook reactions, but I've been quite pleased with how positive people have been in response to the ontological argument. But in any case, I think it's just part of a cumulative case, and some arguments will appeal to some people and some will not. I find that the most powerful argument in sharing with people is the moral argument, because you can ignore the cosmological evidence for the origin of the universe or the fine-tuning of the universe. You can brush aside the ontological argument and get along just fine. But every day you wake up, you answer by how you treat others, whether or not you think people have objective moral value or not. And therefore that moral argument is inescapable. It's existentially inescapable to deal with the question, do I believe that there are objective moral values, that people have objective moral worth, and if so, what's the basis of it? So of all of the arguments that go into this cumulative case, I think probably the most effective and existentially gripping would be the moral argument, certainly not the ontological argument.
Hi, I'm a junior in high school. I was wondering, how do my Christian peers and I within our schools deal with this quickly accumulating atheist outlook that causes fellow classmates to automatically deny me and my ideas just because I'm Christian?
Wait, to deny what? Finish it one more time for me.
Deny me and my ideas just because I am Christian.
First off, it's awesome you came to a conference on apologetics as a junior in high school. Good for you. I have two suggestions. I'd love if anybody else jumps in. Number one is if it's you and your friends and you feel like they're denying you in some capacity, one of the things you have to do is be equipped with good answers and how to engage conversations to stop this from happening in a respectful kind of way. And this can happen when you have reasons for what you believe, why you believe it, and you're able to ask the kinds of questions in a thoughtful manner. You can actually make quite a bit of difference. So you're here, so you see the hunger in this. If some of your friends do as well, I get some of the resources back there. Probably the top thing I would do is get your friends and get them to Summit. Honestly, 12 days of in-depth apologetic training for students. And then you'll be able to think about the issues of marriage, think about the issues of life, think about the existence of God, think about how we know the Bible is true. And then when you have that kind of training, then you're equipped to give more thoughtful answers and not be steamrolled, as Greg Kokel would say. Second is if you feel like atheists are treating you this way, one of the things I would do is I would just try to reach out and befriend some of those people. They may or may not want you to, but in my experience, a lot of people like that, I just go outside of the classroom. I'd show up at their meetings. If they play sports, I'd show up at their sports and support them. I would try to build a genuine relationship with those people so they see you as human beings. Now, they may or may not let you do this, but I think in a lot of circumstances, people will. And when they do that and really see you as a human being for which you have common ground with them, then I think they will, in good chance, many circumstances, treat you differently. Now, if it's abusive and really bad, there might come a point where you have to report it or talk to a teacher and say, look, we are being bullied, we are really being, but that's a last resort that you go to at the end. Anybody else jump in on that one?
Cheat on something, because I don't think in 14 of these I've done this, but there's a method to my madness. And Craig, this question's for you, and it's twofold. In one of your books, you had said something about because of so many of our New Testament scholars not having a real background in Semitic languages, that it really impacts sometimes what they see or don't see. Now, I'm going to make you a bet, and he may be embarrassed to ask you this, but I told you when we started, include Josh. Josh told me his hip was just killing him, and he just said, can I bow out? And I said, yep, we'll love you anyway. So that's why he's not here. I said, you got 6 giants, and I truly believe that. I don't think most of you, unless it's unusual, will ever run into a guy that's got the background that he does and expertise when you're talking manuscripts. I mean, he dealt with that all through the conference. I would like to know, because I want them to know, how many Semitic languages do you read? Because I know it impacts what you can do with the new, and I'm not trying to say it as a show-off. I want them to understand, and I mean this in a great way, you are dealing with some heavyweights here. Are you okay to help me with that?
Yeah, I'm fine. I'll talk about it. I work with 10 languages.
Could you do this in one of the Semitic languages, please, Greg? Prove it.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu. Yeah, would you like to have a prayer? I could tell you a real funny joke in Hebrew. Anyway, yeah, give it to you in English and it'll just kill you, but it's good. Let me, historical Jesus studies is a difficult field because this is just linguistic. It touches on a lot of fields. And in Fabricating Jesus, I talk about that a little bit, and I knew I was on the edge. And there were some Jesus seminar scholars, you know, that group in California, they were offended, and one reviewer said you were hitting below the belt, you know, and stuff like that. But I wasn't trying to be mean about it or anything, but it's a difficult field because it involves a lot of things. Think about it, historical Jesus research. Okay, what was the language of Jesus? It's Aramaic. Aramaic is not taught normally in seminaries. So right away, you've got all these scholars that have maybe 2 years of Greek and 1 year of Hebrew, and they've not studied Aramaic. And so they're going to talk about the words of Jesus and cast colored beads to decide if those are his words. So right away, out of the gate, it's goofy. Bruce Chilton, a good friend of mine at Bard College, he was a member of the Jesus Seminar, and they never listened to him, and he knew Aramaic real well. See, so there's a problem. The other thing is, we're talking about historiography, how you do research in history, how you assess documents, and how you make decisions about what's historical and not historical. That is an area of expertise. The average person in the Jesus Seminar does not know that. See, my own major, in fact, was history, and I was very impressed with a course that was given over to historical methodology, how to assess documents. I don't think there's a single member of the Jesus Seminar that's ever had a course on that. And they don't even know it's a subject. So here they are, and I'm talking about this in Fabricating Jesus. So what is the average Jesus Seminar kind of person? And it's easy to find out because they list their credentials, the fellows, 78 of them. You can see them. They got their BA here in some subject, they got their MDiv at a seminary, they got their PhD somewhere else. Typically it's this, somebody does a BA in psychology or English literature, and he goes to seminary, does a regular MDiv program, gets 1, maybe 2 years of Greek, and maybe 1 semester, maybe 2 in Hebrew, and he decides to pursue a PhD. And he writes a PhD on Luke's understanding of possessions, or something like that. It's perfectly good. Then he joins the Jesus Seminar. He's not equipped. He's not qualified. He hasn't had any work in history or historiography, hasn't studied Aramaic, okay? Doesn't know the Jewish world, has never read the Dead Sea Scrolls, can't access them in their original language in any event, doesn't know any of the early rabbinic stuff or any of the Targums, and so is not trained or equipped in any of the requisite fields in order to cast those beads. But they don't know that they don't know. See, that's the problem. So I talk about that at the beginning. I'm trying to be gentle. I don't want to insult these people. They're my friends. I see them every year at Society of Biblical Literature meetings. They're not properly trained. What's my own training? Well, I was a history major, minored in philosophy. So that's why I just love hearing Bill Craig and Sean McDowell, all these guys talk on these philosophical things. I really track well with them. But I was a history major and pursued that in graduate studies. I went to seminary, but I went crazy over the Greek and the Hebrew and Aramaic and went to Portland State University for classical Greek. Oh my goodness, my head was about to pop open. Then I'd pursue PhD studies and wind up writing a dissertation in Old Testament on Isaiah, which happened to be Jesus' favorite book. And so while there, study Coptic, study Syriac, study more Aramaic, more Hebrew, read unpointed Hebrew text. Do you realize the average biblical studies person cannot read unpointed Hebrew? That's why they're so stuck on the Masoretic text. I was joking in the green room, the lounge with the boys about, do you teach Old Testament here at Dallas Seminary or not? I mean, that sounds really dumb, but they don't. They teach Rabbinic Bible with the Masoretic pointing. They can't read unpointed Hebrew that's from the 1st century BC. The training just isn't there, and seminaries are worse than ever. Now you're lucky if even a semester of Greek's required. And yet these guys go on undertrained, and then they say, well, I'm a historical Jesus scholar. No, you're not. But they just don't know it. So it's actually a difficult field. So, you know, I do work with classical Greek stuff. There are lots of biblical scholars that never had a course in Latin. They've never read an inscription. They can't read a papyrus. The only Greek they read is the printed, systematized Byzantine-era spelling Greek that's in a book with word spacing and the accents, the diacriticals there. They can't read a papyrus. They can't read one sentence. So it's a difficult field. I'm being sympathetic. I'm not trying to be sarcastic. It's a very difficult field, and that's why people get it so badly. They take shortcuts, and everybody's quoting each other. I have traced footnotes back 100 years, and it originated with a guy who misunderstood a text. And it's quoted and referenced and referenced. Nobody has gone back. Everybody likes to refer to this technical book on book hands. And I thought, well, okay, this is interesting. I'm going to get the book. Oh, it's out of print. You can't get it anywhere. No library has it. It took forever to get a hold of it. And then I found out everybody was citing the wrong page. And that told me nobody had seen it. And yet, for Bart Ehrman and others, this was a decisive source for coming to a conclusion about how good the Christian scribes were. Nobody has seen the book. They're all citing the wrong page. It's hard to find. I am scrounging around in German sources that were for 150 years ago. It's in Gothic text. No library has them anymore. Or if they do, they're on the East Coast and they will not check them out for interlibrary loan. Thank goodness for Google Books, because these are public domain. There is no copyright. So there they are, and I download. Oh my gosh, I can barely make out the letters. It's in Gothic German, and the print is horrible. But then you find out what Friedrich Nietzsche actually said, because the translations that we have in English are sanitized. So then I realized all this philosophy I read is in fact misleading, because the most hateful and ugly stuff a lot of these guys said, Nietzsche, Ludwig Feuerbach, and others, they're not in the English translation. You get in the original German and you realize, holy smokes, this stuff is ugly. But somebody named Adolf Hitler could read the German, and it's his philosophical underpinnings that he put into practice. See what I'm saying? So it's really hard to do this kind of work because it involves lots of languages, and some of the texts are inaccessible and are so difficult to get a hold of. And you end up working with 10 languages or more if it's ancient history stuff, and that's not a huge number. Don't be impressed. Robert Dick Wilson could read 30 languages. That impresses me. I mean, that's Egyptian, Ugaritic, yeah. So I just want you to know it's a difficult field. It involves all kinds of stuff. Oh my goodness, my learning curve is very steep, and I'm trying to keep my brain healthy so I can just keep working away at it. But I'll run out of gas one of these days. But it's a tough field. Thanks, Carl, for asking. But yeah, there you have it.
I want to jump in on this only in the sense of, I was asking Dr. Evans a similar question about this last night over dinner. Who are the up-and-coming scholars in this field? And you know what, you junior here in high school, you young people here who are looking for a future in apologetics, we need top-level scholars who are Bible-believing Christians studying this stuff. We need guys who are doing philosophy. We need guys who are doing science at the highest levels. And so I would just encourage you guys, dedicate yourself in service to the Lord in whatever pursuit, whatever field of study God calls you to, because the apologetic community, the church needs you. And there's a place for you, and we need the future Dr. Evans. Some of you guys might be sitting out here. Somebody out here might be the future William Lane Craig. And I would just encourage you to continue to study, continue to pursue, and grow in your faith, seek the Lord, and God can open up incredible doors for you to have a profound impact for the kingdom.
Thank you. I would like you to say thank you to the 5 men here, and we'll hope Josh can hear it wherever he is. God love you. God bless you. We give him a greeting. Just say, yeah.